Welcome to the DS Incubator. Today we start a new series about DBT. DBT stands for Data Build Tool. The goal is to understand and use a minimal DBT project. It's oriented to managers and developers of datasets developed with the DBT tool. And it matters because it helps you create more efficient pipelines and also make them more reliable. What we're going to be covering in this series is first an overview, which I'm going to be moving on to that in a moment, an overview of DBT to understand what it is and why and when it might be useful, and maybe when it's not so useful. And then in other videos, we're going to be covering how to install the required software in a sandbox that GitHub Code Spaces provides. And also, we're going to be trying a few basic commands and exploring a basic structure of a simple project. Here I share the link to the documentation of DBT, which has a ton of resources, but just heads up, if you have used databases before, this might be good for you. But if you are like me and you do not have worked with databases a lot, then this documentation might be a little bit overwhelming and you might struggle to understand, well, I get that, with all this stuff, I can do something very useful, but what is the minimum that I need to understand how this thing works? And the motivation for this series is precisely that I struggled a lot for a couple of days to understand what was the minimum, the bare bones minimum DBT project and how to use it. Okay, so enough about that. Let's now move to the first file here, 01 overview, to cover a little bit of what it is, why, and when to use it. So DBT, as we mentioned before, stands for Data Build Tool. It's open source, and you run it from the terminal. So if you're not very used to running software from the terminal, this might not be the best tool for you. Why it's useful? Well, because it helps you create more efficient and more reliable data pipelines. It helps you to transform the data, test it to verify that it is the way you want it to be, and to create documentation that you can then share with all the stakeholders. Also, it's built in such a way that really encourages best practices that are very common in software engineering, like version control and continuous integration and continuous delivery. But those practices may not be very common in an ETL workflow. So it's great to implement those practices that you may already know about from software engineering. So when it's most useful, it shines really when you need to transform raw data that is in your warehouse or wherever you store that data, maybe in a remote database, for example, and you need to transform it into a more useful state for analysis. It is not so useful in cases when the transformation that you need to do is pretty simple or does not need to scale. And also when your team is not very comfortable with a terminal or with SQL as a language, and when your data is not stored in an SQL-based data warehouse. So if it's local, maybe this tool is not super critical for you. It may still be useful, but not something crucial. All right, so with that, we covered the overview of the series and the overview of the tool. The next video is going to be covered installation.